This morning we have 3 guest speakers from the organization OD-AID. They will be speaking to us about what their organization does and how it impacts so many people, and hopefully will impact us this morning. It certainly did in the first service. We have Lizzie Maldonado, Rachel Gollay, and Vicki Jinks here with us. They will come in order and of their time here at the pulpit, and we'll hear what they have to say. We welcome you very much here.
Shalom, Boker Tov. My name is Rachel Gollay, and I'm here with OD-AID, with Vicki and Lizzie, and we're so grateful to Glenda and to Cindy Fountain for inviting us, and to all of you here at Westside for allowing us to come and share our stories and share our message and talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing here in the community and how we can help end fatal overdose in Fort Worth together. We are working to provide a community-based response to the opioid crisis to help people stay alive even if they're not quite ready to quit using drugs. We want to talk to you today about challenging and changing the way that we see people that use drugs, talk about what harm reduction is, and offer tangible steps that we can take together to make change in our hearts and in our minds and in the communities that we serve, in our families, our places of worship, our workplaces, our neighborhoods, and anywhere we can make moves toward restorative justice for people who use drugs. We will be learning together how to resist stigmatization, punishment, and about the criminal justice system as well. But again, I'm really grateful for your presence and your attention and your open hearts and minds in this discussion. It can be challenging for any of us to change, but we're really optimistic about creating a community of people supporting each other while we change together and build a more beautiful future. So with that, I'm going to invite Vicki up to share her words, and thank you again.
Hi, I am Vicki Jinks, and I do join Rachel and Lizzie in thanking you for having us here today. I am one of the OD-AID organizers, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about myself. I work full-time for a sales agency. I've been there for 18 years and love my job. I have been married to my best friend for 38 years. I have a new dog with whom I am totally infatuated. He's become the joy of my life. And I'm also a very proud mom of 3 children, 3 kids. My oldest daughter is a general manager at a popular restaurant here in Fort Worth, and she's a great mom. My oldest son is a scientist working for a lab developing medical devices. And my youngest son, Seth, is no longer with us. Seth was our little big surprise. He came 13 years after my first child, and he brought us so much joy. You know, have you ever had a surprise that you never anticipated something happening, and then when it does, it's like you knew you needed it all along? That's kind of how it was with Seth. But his addiction brought us a heartache that I never could have imagined. When he was about 14 years old, we discovered that we had a really big problem. Seth had a big problem. So for about 6 years, almost every minute of every day of our lives were centered around trying to help Seth and trying to figure out how to keep him alive and fight the battle of addiction. In December 2013, just a few days after his 20th birthday, that battle came to an end. We had a call from the medical examiner late one icy night that Seth was gone. He had passed away from an accidental overdose. Prior to that time, he had had 6 months of sobriety, and those were some of the most wonderful 6 months of his life that we enjoyed. But, you know, everyone grieves differently. There's no right or wrong way. There's no manual that says this is how you do it. One thing I knew is that I had to do something. I had to get to work. And there were lots of mornings, most mornings I woke up, the very first thought in my head was, I don't want to live anymore. I just want to die because I don't think I can handle this pain. And there was a sense of anger that I woke up every morning with my hand in a fist because I just wanted to ram it through the sheetrock behind my bed. But I had a choice. And every morning I got out of bed, I put my feet on the floor, and I determined today I'm going to seek peace and I'm going to seek joy. So I started doing volunteer work and started trying to really educate myself and learn more about substance abuse disorders. There was so much during that time that we were going through that with Seth that you just, as a parent, or at least we had no time to absorb what was really happening a lot of the time and to seek the information that now I wish I had had. So I started working on that, started doing volunteer work. And then one day I saw a post on Facebook by someone named Lizzie Maldonado. Never met her, never heard of her, but she had posted, is anyone interested in discussing harm reduction? So I looked it up, and I knew immediately, this is it. This is where I want to spend my time. This is what gives me hope. This is going to bring hope. So I started learning more and more about that. The reason that I am passionate about this work is not just because we lost a son to an overdose. It's because of the people that I've loved and have come to know since, who I've seen overcome what addiction can do to their lives. It's because I've seen people who can be kept alive long enough until they're at a point that they're ready to be healthy and make a change, build beautiful, successful, healthy lives that they enjoy. We often say, you may hear it again today, I'm not sure, but we often say this, and it's such a powerful statement that I repeat it over and over. No one can ever overcome death by an overdose. But there is always hope for someone to overcome a substance abuse disorder. As long as they're alive and breathing, there is always that hope. No matter how dark it looks and seems, there's always that hope. One thing I wanted to say real quickly is I've recently heard from a young man that he was talking about how using sometimes feels like a warm hug from Jesus. And when he described that, I thought, well, who wouldn't want to feel that? Can you imagine the pain that ends in your life? Can you imagine the boredom it ends, the loneliness it ends? Who wouldn't want to feel that? But then as I watched what was happening in his life, I saw that those warm hugs turned into some pretty nasty claws that started to consume every minute of his life and just started destroying everything else. So please know that my hope, personally, is that I don't want to see anyone's life controlled by a substance or anything that has a negative impact on them. But I do understand that they are struggling and trying to cope and survive. And that wherever they are in their journey, with whatever's happening, they are human beings. And they deserve love and compassion, and they deserve hope. Thank you. With that, we're going to have Lizzie come up and tell you all about harm reduction. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Maldonado. These are my two kids making all this noise up here. They don't go out much, apparently, in places where they need to be quiet, so it's my mistake. Each member of our team at OD8 has been personally affected by the opioid crisis. We have lost loved ones. We have seen loved ones struggle. We knew we had to do something, and we didn't know exactly what. We definitely didn't know OD8 would exist this time last year. The reason I'm telling you this is because anyone can organize to better their community. It's about finding resources and power and redistributing them to people who need it. And we can all do that in different ways. What OD8 today does, which Rachel mentioned, is distribute Narcan and naloxone and other harm reduction supplies like fentanyl test strips into the community. Naloxone, for those of you who may not know, is a life-saving medication. It's not a controlled substance. It can reverse an otherwise fatal overdose from opioids. There are a lot of barriers to getting access to this medication, which we'll also discuss briefly, but first I want to tell you a story about my dad who's in recovery. In May of 2017, his mom passed away suddenly. They spoke on the phone every day. She was his anchor in recovery. I was really wrapped up making my own family at the time. And when she passed, I made him a promise that I would just call him every day for a while, even just for 5 minutes, for as long as I could. Even through a relapse, we made a pretty good run on that promise. About 2 years later, my dad and I speak almost every day. It has transformed our relationship to stick it out through those tough times. There's more honesty, more care, more awareness in our relationship than there ever was. A few years before that, I had read Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream. That had helped me see people who use drugs differently, with more understanding and more patience and more love. He says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And of course, addiction can put a strain on connection if you have a personal experience, like Vicki mentioned. Wounded people certainly wound people. But as I started to research addiction and what kind of evidence there was for recovery programs and the war on drugs, I was faced with this absolutely brutal and dehumanizing system that wasn't good enough. It wasn't gentle enough. It wasn't effective enough. It wasn't promising enough for my dad. It wasn't effective enough for Vicki's son or for any of your loved ones. I saw the machinery my dad faced, and it just seemed so pointless to me, causing all that pain with so little to show for it, such few results that were really impactful. Certainly recovery program models work for some people. Most studies show it's about 3 to 8% of people. They certainly don't work for everyone. I think we can see that with our own eyes. We need to fundamentally change the way that we address addiction in America. Hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of lives depend on us doing this differently. So we organize this work out of love, out of our pockets, and because we have seen firsthand that this is the compassionate response that our community needs. Angela Davis once said, "Prisons don't disappear social problems, they disappear human beings." And disappearing human beings through criminalization isn't only inhumane, it isn't working. The war on drugs is a $1 trillion failure. Right now, 70 million people in the US have a criminal record, and most estimates show at least half of those records are from nonviolent drug offenses alone. Meanwhile, getting a criminal record means being cut off from the traditional economy. For so many of our neighbors, it means the breaking up of our communities. It means the separation of our families. It means taking someone's parents, someone's siblings, someone's children into cages for addiction alone. And addiction and drug use as a result have remained almost unchanged. If someone is lucky enough or maybe even privileged enough by their race, their wealth, who they know, how they're perceived to avoid incarceration, they are referred to a labyrinth of recovery programs that make up an industry that operates for profit, which is important for us to understand as well. And that for the most part boast extremely low success rates, reinforce stigma and shame, and use harsh, depersonalizing, military and abstinence-only methodology that is rooted in old ideas. We need new ideas. We need them now. The old ideas are not working. What people who use drugs need above all is not incarceration. They don't need paternalism. They don't need shame. They don't need stigma or punishment. They need more than anything to be alive. More people died in 1 year in this country from opioids alone than US soldiers died in the entire Vietnam War. And every interaction we make, knowing that information is a choice. Every dollar we spend on incarceration is a dollar we are not spending on restoration. Every time we use punitive justice to disappear a person, we lose an opportunity to heal ourselves, to heal people who use drugs, and to heal our communities. Every time we take a low road and call someone an addict or a junkie, we miss an opportunity to elevate our dialogue, to acknowledge our complicity, our network of mutuality, and we allow another person to be dehumanized, and for policies that harm them to be acceptable as a result of that dehumanization. We absolve ourselves and our systems of their responsibility to create optimal conditions for life. And we accept tough love and personal responsibility as a cheap replacement. But we have a problem in this society that goes far beyond personal responsibility. For the third consecutive year, life expectancy has declined in the US, and researchers have linked a related increase in deaths by diseases of despair, which means suicide, alcohol poisoning, drug overdoses, things like that. We have a crisis of disconnection, ultimately, from healthy bodies, from healthy environments, from healthy relationships, healthy communities, and certainly from healthy systems. Because we hold stigmas against people who use drugs, we have failed to see drug use as a symptom and result of our society rather than a cause of all the problems within it. The drug issue is a class issue and it's a race issue. People of color and poor people are far more likely to be harassed and jailed for drug use than white people and middle-class people, even though drug use is shown to be roughly the same across all races, classes, and ages. And in the 1990s, the drug epidemic of the time was crack cocaine, and its face was that of young people of color who were branded as violent, vicious super predators. Now that the opioid crisis is here and its face is white suburbia and rural America, the response is geared toward compassion, mental health, access to health care, things like that. It's not that we're not using the right response now. We don't want to punish another group because we already punished one group. We need to use that response and scale it across every person using every drug every single time. We need to fundamentally accept that drug use is always a health issue and never a criminal one. We can also make strides by accepting that addiction is very often linked to trauma and pain. Drugs across the board are used to cope with mental, physical, and spiritual pain. And inflicting more pain on people struggling to cope with their pain has gotten us nowhere. But it has gained a booming prison industrial complex and pharmaceutical giants unspeakable profits. And I know that that's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, certainly at church. But it's important to note we need to follow the money of the crises that plague our communities. Who is profiting from our pain? As community organizers, one of the things we're always thinking about is power. That's also an uncomfortable thing for people to think about. Who has it, who doesn't, who needs more, and who needs less? Harm reduction as a practice of delivering condoms, clean needles, naloxone, and other life-saving supplies is only one part of harm reduction after all. It's said that harm reduction is radical love because, as Angela Davis defined radical, we're trying to get to the root of these issues. Harm reduction with a capital H and R is a movement that ultimately seeks to redistribute power to those who are most vulnerable to structural violence. That includes people who don't grow up with emotional stability or in safe spaces and never learn to cope or heal as a result. It includes people who don't grow up with economic stability and look outside the traditional economies to meet their needs. It includes people who don't grow up with relational stability and make bonds with reliable drugs that never let them down. There's a phrase in harm reduction right now that we have harm reduction strategies for drug users, but we actually need harm reduction strategies for drug dealers as well, because street-level drug dealers do not have power. They are not responsible for the crises of addiction or the harms of criminalization. With regard to power, we also have to ask how to build it. How do we release some power from the hands of pharmaceutical giants who predicted this crisis of addiction and profited from it anyway? It's well known that the maker of OxyContin, Purdue Pharmaceutical, they researched the addictive properties of their drug. They hid the evidence of that addictive property, and they heavily incentivized the sale and prescription of that drug anyway. It also recently came to light about 2 months ago that they were researching the financial benefits, running financial models about developing a patented opioid recovery program to profit from the back end of the crisis they had a hand in creating. Even with all of these lawsuits that they're facing for the deaths from overdose that began often with the prescription of their drug, they're not even facing a dent in the profits that they made from the sale of that drug. And companies run those models all the time. They already know that. They know that any consequence they face will not outweigh the benefit of doing that. So Yeah, we definitely need to take power back from pharmaceutical giants. We also need to release power from the hands of the police, who enforce the war on drugs at the front lines and have used the war on drugs to expand their power, their machinery, their budgets as a result. We also need to release power from the hands of politicians who sell being tough on crime to be reelected, knowing these policies do not have solutions for addiction or drug use. We want politicians to be tough on crime because deep down with the stigma we have all inherited and internalized, we want drug use and even drug users to disappear. We want it to be managed, dealt with, punished, criminalized, whatever will make it go away. And our internalized stigma plays a role in making policies that harm people who use drugs possible and popular for both lawmakers and enforcers. Challenging stigma toward people who use drugs is a critical part of our work as a result. I can't tell you how many mothers I have heard describe children they lost to overdose as not like those junkies, that they didn't look like someone who used drugs, or that they were a good kid. It breaks my heart to hear these women normally have to make that distinction because there is no stereotype that fits someone who uses drugs. I already know that. You can't tell who's using drugs by looking at someone. And because I know parents say those things because they're struggling with a stigma that runs so deep, it's conditioned in all of us by our culture, and it actually complicates the grieving of parents who have lost their children, or of children who have lost their parents, of all the relationships that were put to rest by drug-related deaths. We are not only trying to encourage more sympathy and compassion for people who use drugs, but also a recognition of their autonomy, an understanding of why people choose to use drugs, to cope with pain, to escape, to release, and a way forward to maintain bonds even through drug use and the damage that we have experienced from addiction. I want to read you a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, I think is that. I probably should have done a little pronunciation thing on online, but once there is seeing, there must be acting. Otherwise, what is the use of seeing? So now what can we do with this information? We need to reduce harm and challenge stigma. James Baldwin once said, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety." That means we need to change ourselves. We need to change the way we think and the way we treat people we know who use drugs or struggle with addiction. We need to take action. You can sign up to volunteer with us today, obviously, but there are numerous other programs in town. We really like True Worthplace as a partner of ours. They are centered in dignified outreach to people who live on the street in Fort Worth, and they are aware of the practices of harm reduction and incorporate them in their work. They can always use more volunteers who are committed to acceptance and understanding, working directly with people who live on the street. We need to focus on healing and understanding. That means focusing on healing and restorative justice instead of punitive justice, even in our own lives. How can we change just one relationship with this new information? We must advocate to end the war on drugs. We need drugs to be legalized, yes, legal, decriminalized, and we need restorative justice to release everyone in prison on drug offenses and to restore their records to begin healing the damage that was inflicted upon them by this disastrous war on drug users. We need to contact our lawmakers and demand support specifically for a Good Samaritan bill in the state of Texas. We need a bill that will give immunity to anyone who calls 911 for help in an emergency to save another person's life. As of right now, anyone who calls to bring emergency services to the scene is at risk of being arrested for just being involved in a drug-related incident, let alone maybe having their own personal stash. We also need to advocate in our communities for the idea that recovery is not linear. We can support people in our families and communities by spreading the idea that abstinence is not the only way to recovery, and that we need to expand the way we think about drug use and abuse. We also need to support innovative policies like safer consumption sites, needle exchanges, and access to naloxone that are evidence-based, have saved lives, and face increased scrutiny from public officials and more conservative members of our communities. We need to recognize also where we have power and influence. We have relational influence with our relatives and our loved ones, in our religious communities, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods. Some people have policy influence as well. If you're a social worker, a public official, teacher, medical practitioner, numerous other careers, you can influence institutional policies to include harm reduction practices. You can also leverage your citizens' influence to contact your lawmakers, contact your local police department, contact your local health department. Ask them what they are doing to reduce harm. Is their only strategy to send drug users to jail? Is that the end of their game? Do they support the Good Samaritan bill, etc.? And above all, we need to learn how to love radically. We need to love ourselves radically. We need to accept our own mistakes in handling maybe drug use of our own or that of people we love, and be willing to engage in conflict resolution to heal and recover from the trauma and pain that can result. We need to love people who use drugs radically, work with them to find meaningful solutions for their needs. You are never the expert in someone else's experience. People are the experts in their own lived experiences. And we need to love our communities radically and become willing to be complicit in the systems and structures that affect everyone within them. We brought free overdose prevention kits today of a drug called naloxone. It's not a controlled substance. It's legal to carry and administer and distribute in the state of Texas. But there are barriers to access. There's a standing order for the drug Narcan, which is like a more consumer-friendly version of naloxone. It's a nasal spray. You can get that at the pharmacy for $150 usually, or about $40 with your private insurance. The great thing about getting naloxone from us is that we keep no record that you have a kit of naloxone, whereas obviously if you use your private insurance, that creates a trail, and if you buy it at the pharmacy, that can create a trail. Sometimes people get nervous about having systems of record have their information in them regarding this, but we'll teach you how to use it. We also usually recommend considering it to be first aid. It certainly can't be used alone. You need to have someone with you or be the other person who's there with someone, because obviously once someone begins showing the symptoms of an overdose, they are no longer in control, or they don't have the capacity to administer naloxone themselves. So we recommend keeping it in your car, keeping a kit at your house, and having it on you as often as you can. We have definitely given kits to people who said that they didn't need one because they didn't know anyone who was struggling with an opioid use disorder. First, you definitely can't tell who's struggling with an opioid use disorder around you. And second of all, again, we consider keeping it first aid because you might just come across someone. You never know. Sometimes people who use drugs want to use in public so that they have that extra layer of safety of having other people around to possibly intervene if something happens. So please come pick up a free overdose prevention kit from us. We will give you a really brief training on how to use it and how to offer rescue breathing to someone. And it can reverse the effects of an otherwise fatal opioid overdose for about 30 to 60 minutes. So can definitely buy you time for emergency services to get on site, for the person to recover a little bit before they start getting additional care and that sort of thing. So I really want to thank you for your time and attention and for having us today. It's very heartwarming to see the response so far. So thank you so much.